Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this scene from the wonderful Lake District. It's using a photograph from Pixabay as inspiration. The photograph itself is much larger than this, and I've cropped the photograph down just to give me a nice sort of almost panoramic view of this beautiful lake with the mountains in the background and some distinctive rocks which give us a lovely foreground full of sort of interesting texture. So here's my crop of the photograph, and as you can see my painting's fairly similar, but it's not trying to be an exact copy. It's my interpretation of the scene. So I'll show you how I painted it. The first step, as always, was to roughly sketch out the important features of the painting to start with in pencil. I'm using an ordinary carpenter's pencil to sketch with, as it's got a nice chunky lead so I don't get distracted with too much detail. And I'm using the back side of Saunders Waterford rough watercolour paper, 100% cotton, because I prefer the texture on the back to that of the front with the rough type of grain. I'm going to paint the scene wet in wet to start with, so I'm going to wet the sky completely. I'll bring a bit of water down over the mountains and then I shall wet into the water as well. I'm using a size 22 mop brush to wet these areas, making sure the water soaks in nicely and isn't too wet. I just want a nice even sheen across the page. And then taking my Princeton Neptune Aqua Elite modeler brush, I'm going to start to paint the sky using a mixture of blue made from cerulean, ultramarine and cobalt blue. I'm working around, leaving gaps for clouds, and then a little bit later I shall add a bit of burnt sienna to my blues to bring in some cloud colours, and then bring that colour over the mountains and across the loch. I've darkened up this water in the foreground with a touch of Payne's Grey to my blue mixture, and now I'm using a clean, damp flat brush to just lift out a few lighter streaks across the front of the water, just to add a little bit of movement. Because I'm working wet in wet at the moment, these marks will all soften back and diffuse, as will all the colours in the sky. So I now need to walk away, not touch it anymore, let it dry completely. It's important to learn, if you get to this stage, not to fiddle anymore, just to trust the process and let it dry. So now that it's completely dry, I'm using my size 14 Escoda Perla synthetic round brush, and I've mixed up a fairly desaturated mid-value of green, and I've mixed using sap green with a little bit of raw umber in it, and then I've made a slightly darker mix by adding a bit of sepia, maybe a bit of Payne's grey, and I'm going to paint these distant hills and mountains across the horizon line, trying to vary up the colour and the value. This is the wet on dry technique, where I'm using the sort of wet paint onto the dry painting, and you can see that the edges that I'm creating for my marks are much harder, much more deliberate. The paint stays where I put it, but within my mountains the paint is softly diffusing where the wet paint, where two different sort of shades or hues meet each other, and so I'm getting a wet in wet effect within my wet on dry application. I'm now using a mixture of Payne's grey, sepia and my sap green, and I'm painting in the mid-ground group of trees that come down and extend in over the lake. I hope you can see how I'm using my pencil sketch as a road map, and this is why I think a simple pencil sketch is really important, because it helps you to check that everything fits on the page, that it's all in the right place and that the composition works. And then all you need to do is think about colour mixing and thinking about making sure you balance out your tonal values as you paint, which of course is easier said than done, but with practice, this is something that can be immensely satisfying and can produce beautiful watercolour landscape paintings in the loose style. I shall now switch over to sap green and then raw sienna, maybe with a little bit of burnt sienna mixed into it, and paint in the sort of green hillside here. For this I'll use sap green, then I'll switch to some raw sienna for the mid-ground beach and just the suggestions of a few distant rocks. And now just before the paint dries completely, I'll use my palette knife just to scrape a few faint sort of texture lines, contour lines if you like, into the mountains in places where the paint is still slightly damp. Again, this is just adding a little bit more variety, maybe bringing a few little marks down across that mid-ground beach. So the next thing I'm going to do is bring those rocks forward, starting really small but getting larger towards the foreground, using my 3/4 inch flat brush and some fairly rich paint. I'm focusing on some nice sort of browns and greys here, so I'm using Payne's grey and raw umber, maybe dipping into a bit of burnt sienna, maybe a bit of ultramarine blue, building up my rock shapes, but leaving plenty of gaps between them for the beach. I want the paint nice and thick here because I'm going to use the palette knife to scrape in some sort of highlights that will help to give shape and form to the dark values here that I'm using for these rocks. Trying to keep the base of the rocks fairly flat looking as they either emerge from the water or from the bank. I'm now going to go and make a cup of coffee and let everything dry, and then come back and finish off the painting by just bringing together a few details. So here's the dry painting, and the first thing I'm going to do is just fill in the little gaps on this stand of trees here. I want them completely silhouetted, but I don't want them fully silhouetted in dark. So I'm going to go over the little unpainted patches and any areas that I feel needs it with sap green, which will bring a slightly lighter value to that, and then I shall bring in some darker value right at the base. For this I'm using a small calligraphy brush, but any small brush with a good point will do for filling in this kind of detail. Then just a few little lines for some texture in that hillside there. There may be a few lines of shadow across the beach, keeping things fairly horizontal anywhere near the water. And for this I favour my flat brush. I use the tips, and it just can give me some really nice, suitable marks for those sorts of areas. I'm looking at the painting and just need to sort of dab back in a few places so that's not too dark. And I think I'm going to cover over some of my scraped out marks on the distant mountains here and there. So you can see I'm only making tiny adjustments just to suit my personal taste at this point in the painting. Again, I can make some slight adjustments to the foreground water, and I'm putting a bit of blue with ultramarine blue, a little bit of Payne's grey across the foreground in and around my rocks, so that you can see that the rocks are surrounded by water in places, and then just darkening up the foreground water a little bit, keeping some nice horizontal sweeps of paint through to give a little tiny bit of movement in the water. And with that last sort of touch of blue, I think I'm happy with the painting. Just blending it in a little bit more, keeping my brush strokes horizontal so that the water stays flat. And now let's take the tape off and have a little look. This helps us to see it with fresh eyes. We see the painting almost as if it was framed, and so can spot if there's any sort of inconsistencies, anything that we need still to do, maybe any values that need correcting. But I'm overall fairly happy with this nice loose painting. This is the colours as they look in real life. My studio lights tend to sort of bleach things out a bit. So I hope you found that useful. I think my main tips for beginners today would be just to make sure that you can sketch your scene out really simply, don't overcomplicate things. And a nice simple pencil sketch creates the perfect roadmap for your washes of paint that follow. Start off with soft washes of paint, and then once that's dry, build up just enough detail and dark enough values to bring the painting together, and use the largest brushes that you can get away with for each area. That will keep you nice and loose and keep your brushwork fresh without looking overworked. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments. I love to read them. And thank you so much for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And if you'd like to support the channel, then please follow the links below to our Patreon pages. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. Many thanks again, and happy painting. Bye.